Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? A while back I made some chess pieces out of boxwood and ebony, and now I'm going to make a box to hold them. To match the pieces, I'm going to make one end of the box out of ebony, the other end is going to be made from boxwood, and the rest of the box, the front and the back sides and the top and the bottom, are going to be made from walnut. Inside the box, I'm going to make holders that are attached to the side walls of the box using spring-loaded pin hinges, and that will allow the holders to rotate or to swivel. So, let's get started. Before I began making the chess pieces, I knew that the largest piece of boxwood that I had was larger than what I needed, so that gave me an opportunity to resaw it to get a couple of pieces of boxwood that I could use for the side of the box. I still had the old ebony log that I had used to make the chess pieces out of, so I got out my chainsaw and I did my best to cut a flat piece of ebony that I could use for the other side of the box. The size of this piece of ebony was my limiting factor, so I tried to maximize the yield that I could get out of it by drawing lines, and then I would cut it out on the bandsaw. Of course, cutting this piece with a chainsaw doesn't yield the best results, so I had to run this through the jointer multiple times to get one side that was flat. And then I ran it multiple times through the planer to get the other side parallel to the jointed side, and also to get it to the right thickness, which was right around 1/2 inch. I had jointed one of the edges, and then I ran it through the table saw to get the maximum width possible up to the point where I didn't have any of those light colored spots anymore. Before gluing up the resawn boxwood pieces, I need to joint the mating edges, and I'm marking one piece with an I to be inside touching the fence of the jointer, and the other side with an O, and that's going to be away from the fence. That way, if my fence isn't perfectly square, the error will cancel itself out. And it only took a single pass with each piece. I clamped the pieces horizontally, but I also added a couple of blocks and clamped it vertically to make sure that the board remained flat. And then I ran the piece through the drum sander to get it to the desired thickness. And again, the ebony is my limiting factor for size, so I'm cutting it to the maximum length that I can, and then I will design the rest of the box dimensions from that piece. Next, I'm going to use this single piece of walnut. It's quite wide and it's quite thick as well. So from this piece, I'm going to get the top and the bottom of the box, as well as a couple of pieces to form the sides. The top and bottom pieces will be roughly 1/4 inch thick, and the side pieces will be cut here just a little bit more than 1/2 inch, and then I will plane or sand them down to be just a little bit under 1/2 inch. And this piece of walnut had some voids in it, so I'm just filling that on the top and the bottom, especially on the top, with some epoxy. of the side pieces that I'm running through the drum sander to get it down to the appropriate thickness. And now I'm cutting everything to the same width. So the ebony, the boxwood, and the walnut pieces. I'm going to have a divider in the middle of the box, and that's going to be a little narrower than the side pieces, so not quite as high. Next, I'm cutting everything to the right length, and I'm using a stop block on my fence. And I also have a piece of wood on the front side of my fence, and that helps to prevent any tear out that might occur otherwise. And for these shorter pieces, instead of using a stop block on the fence, I'm using the stop block on my miter gauge. And I have a couple of pieces of boxwood left over, and I'm going to use those to do the test cuts on my box joint jig to make sure that everything is set up properly. And after doing this first test, it was pretty close, but it was just a little bit looser than what I would have liked. So I made it a quick adjustment and tightened it up for a tighter fit. I really couldn't afford to make any mistake at this point because I did not have any more boxwood left over, and I did not want to have to cut another piece of ebony. So it was very important that I do the test cut and make sure that everything fit before I cut the real pieces. Next, I'm cutting a dado using a router bit, a 1/4 inch router bit, and this is to hold the bottom of the box. Now before assembling the box, I have to drill holes in the two side pieces as well as the middle divider. And these holes are for the spring-loaded pin hinges to fit inside. And I had to measure these very carefully to make sure they were in the proper location and to make sure that they were perfectly lined up. This is the point where I would normally batch them up and realize I had made a mistake, but fortunately everything worked well. Now, because I'm using real hardwood instead of plywood for the bottom and also for the top, I can't glue this in entirely because the bottom would want to expand or contract depending on seasonal changes. So I'm just putting a little dot of glue at the midpoint on the two end pieces, and that way if the wood does need to expand or contract, it's free to move, and it doesn't fit tightly all the way to the end of the dado slot, so there is room for expansion in there. I've oriented the wood grain of the bottom so that the bottom panel is going to expand only from front to back. It's not going to expand from side to side. So I'm clamping everything up, and I'm using a couple of corner squares to make sure that, in fact, the box is actually square. And since those clamps were in the way, I did not insert the middle divider piece until the next day. And for this divider, similar to the end pieces, I've only put a single drop of glue at the midpoint of the bottom so that the bottom can still expand and contract. And then I've put glue on each of the ends. I wanted to make sure that it was exactly in the middle, and also that it was sitting squarely. Now for the chess piece holders, I'm going to cut these pieces to be square. And this is just an approximate cut on the table saw, and then I'll run everything through the planer to get it to the exact dimension that I want. And I have some smaller blocks that I'm using for the pawns, and then for the larger pieces that have bigger bases, like a king and a queen, I moved the fence over a little bit to cut larger blocks. And now I'm running everything through the planer to get it to the exact size that I want. And now, using the stop block on my miter gauge, I'm cutting all the pieces to the exact length. These need to be cut exactly so that they fit inside the box, leaving only a small amount of room, maybe a 1/16 of an inch on both pieces, to allow for the pieces to rotate freely. Now I'm marking the locations of each of the holes. I'm drilling holes with a Forstner bit, actually multiple Forstner bits depending on the size of the base of the piece, and then each piece will fit into its own hole. To minimize the chances for an error at the drill press, I'm starting each hole with an awl to make it easy to position the Forstner bit into that hole. I'm drilling the largest hole first, and this is the hole for the king. For the chess piece holders, I couldn't afford to use boxwood and ebony for these, so I'm using walnut and maple. And I'm drilling one hole with the largest Forstner bit in the walnut and in the maple to hold the king. And then the remaining 3 holes are going to be a slightly smaller Forstner bit that are going to hold a bishop, a knight, and a rook. And then the next set of blocks will hold a queen, a bishop, a knight, and a rook. And then the remaining 2 blocks for each color will hold all of the pawns. Now I'm drilling a 1/8 inch hole in each end of the holders, and the hole is positioned 3/8 of an inch from the bottom and 3/8 of an inch from the back. And now I'm setting up my router table with a 1/16 inch router bit, and this is going to be used to cut slots into the back side of each of the holders. And the purpose of the slot is to be able to remove the spring-loaded hinge pins if needed, if you ever needed to remove the holder from the box. That's the only way to get them out. Now the instructions, I got these hinge pins from Lee Valley, and the instructions say to use a 16th inch drill bit. And I tried that, but maybe it's just the quality of the drill bit that I had, but it was bending too much and I couldn't cut it straight. I couldn't drill it straight. So I resorted to using the router, which is actually a much more repeatable and more accurate process. So I'm glad that the drill bit did not work out. And with stop blocks set up, I just routed out the very short slot on each end. Now at this point I'm rounding over the bottom corner of a very small piece, so it's a little dangerous to do this. I held it very securely. I didn't want to use any type of a push stick or a holder because I was afraid that I would lose control of it. So I felt more comfortable using my hands. I just was very, very careful. I would have preferred to have rounded over the edge when this was a longer piece before cutting them into the individual holders, but I feared that it would be very difficult to accurately measure and position the hole in the ends of each of the pieces, and so that's why I did it this way. Now the individual holders are ready for finishing, and I'm going to flock the insides of the holes to make a nice cozy little spot for the pieces to fit into. And the first step for flocking is you need to seal the wood. And so I'm just using a quick coat of shellac for this. After the shellac dried, I finished it with a coat of lacquer, and I wanted to finish these as much as possible before starting the flocking process because it would be quite difficult to spray these with lacquer after they'd been flocked. It would make the flocking part a little bit crusty if I had done that. And now it's ready for flocking, so I start by carefully applying the adhesive, and I'm using a small brush to paint it on the inside. If these were rectangular holes, I would probably have taped them, but it's a lot more difficult to tape a circle. So I just very carefully painted it and wiped anything that was in the wrong place very quickly so that it didn't soak in. And that's one of the reasons that it's important to finish the piece or seal the piece before you apply the adhesive, because the adhesive will soak into the wood and bleed into places where you don't want it to be seen. And once the adhesive had been applied, I filled up the flocking tube with the powder, and then I just applied it with a simple pumping action. And it's important to apply it generously because you don't want to miss any spots. I normally would have done this with a box around it as well, but I wanted to make it visible for the camera. It's okay to use more than you really need to apply. I think more is better, and then you can tap out the part that didn't stick and put it back in the bag and reuse it at another time. I let that cure for a day, and now I'm cleaning it up with 320 grit sandpaper just to clean up any excess adhesive that you don't want to appear. And now I'm sanding the box, especially the corners of the edges, to make sure that everything is eased and softened a little bit. And because I made an extra queen for each color, I'm making a little holder that's going to be attached with some CA glue on the back side of the box. And I don't want any tear out on this, so I drilled the hole almost all the way through with a Forstner bit, and then I used the hole that protruded through as the starting point to drill from the opposite side. That's going to serve as the rounded bottom to hold the neck of the queen, and then I'm using my bandsaw to cut it out. So now I have a U shape that will be used to hold the queen. Now I'm applying a little bit of CA glue, and then I will spray that little holder on the back and bottom side with some accelerant. And then I'll just hold it in place for a few seconds, and it's stuck. And now the box is ready to be finished, so I'm wiping on some shellac, and then after it dried, I sprayed on a coat of lacquer. And now I'm going to make the top, and I'm cutting strips of walnut that will serve as the frame that goes around the outside, the perimeter of the top. And I'm cutting miter joints. Cutting the top that's going to fit in the frame, and then I will cut a dado. And now I'm cutting a rabbet on the underside of the top of the box, and this will allow the top to sit flush with the top of the frame. I actually made it so that it was a little bit below the top of the frame, but just ever so slightly. And then I'll cut a slot or a dado into the frame pieces, and the top piece will sit in that. And again, to allow for wood expansion and contraction on the ends of the top, I'm just putting a little dot of glue. And then the frame will hold everything in place. And I cut the top of the box to be longer and wider than the box itself. That way there's room to get your fingers under the top to be able to lift it up. And now to add strength to those miter joints, I'm going to cut splines, slots for splines, and I'm going to put 2 splines in each corner. And I simply inserted a 1/2-inch sheet of plywood to move the board over to cut the second spline. The splines may look like they're placed in kind of a weird location because they're not equidistant from the top and bottom, but that's because I'm going to cut a 45-degree chamfer along the bottom edge of the top. So once the chamfer is cut, they will be more or less equidistant from the top and bottom. I'll just apply a little bit of clampering pressure, not too much, but just a little bit to make sure that they're glued in securely. I cut the splines off a little bit roughly because I knew that I could run the box top through the table saw and clean up all of the edges. And then I cut a rabbet around the bottom edge so that the lid would fit inside the box. And after cutting that with my dado set, I'm using a shoulder plane or a rabbeting plane to clean up the cuts. And then I talked about the chamfer bit. I'm running that through. And now I just want to round the corners, so I'm marking that with a pencil line using a 7/16 inch socket wrench. And then I'm using my disc sander to smooth it out. And now I'm wiping it with a coat of shellac. And then when it dries, I will sand it lightly with 320 grit sandpaper and then apply a coat of lacquer. And now I have these Lee Valley spring-loaded hinge pins. And it was easier than I thought it would be to install these. I was worried that I was going to run into problems and I'd have to use those slots to remove the pins and reposition things, but they went in very easily. So I gotta ask, would you make it?